All right, I think we are good. Okay. All right. Um, yes, okay, we are good. Excellent. Okay. Well, I'd first like to say thank you all for joining us for this event. We at Left Bank Books are so honored and excited to present noted author, celebrated academic, the remarkable thinker, Dr. Carol Anderson. It is my delight, of course, it is my delight to get to join her in conversation. My name is Danielle King. I'm assistant manager and head of our used book department at Left Bank Books. A couple of quick notes before we dive into our chat. For everyone tuning in, I would love to thank you so much for your presence and providing the sense of community that our events are some of the most special things a person can get to do. To our not from in town folks, we thank you so much for your support. You will all be able to ask questions throughout the event. Just go ahead and pop them in the comments bar on the right side of your screen, and we will get to them at the end during our Q&A portion. Tonight's guest is possible because of all of your support. Independent bookstores are vital platforms for diverse thought and provide invaluable support for authors, readers, and greater communities. In addition, when you support Left Bank Books, your money goes directly into the local economy, helps us keep our bookstores open, helps us keep the streets paved, the libraries funded, the parks free, and so many other things that make St. Louis a great place to live. We thank you all for shopping local and supporting our event. At Left Bank, we're working every day to bring you fun, educational, and revolutionary events, both in person and online. And so for tonight, Carol Anderson is the Charles Howard Candler Professor and Chair of African American Studies at Emory University. A contributor to the 1619 Project, she is also the author of Eyes Off the Prize, One Person, No Vote, longlisted for the National Book Award and a finalist for the John Kenneth Galbraith Award, and White Rage, a personal favorite of mine, a New York Times bestseller and winner of the National Book Critics Circle Award. She was named a Guggenheim Fellow for Constitutional Studies and is a member of the American Academy of Arts and Sciences. In the book we will be discussing tonight, the second, Carol powerfully illuminates the history and impact of the Second Amendment, how it was designed and how it has consistently been constructed to keep African Americans powerless and vulnerable. The Second Amendment is not about guns, but about anti-Blackness, and this book sheds shocking new light on another dimension of racism in America. The book, is neither a pro-gun nor an anti-gun book. The lens is the citizenship rights and human rights of African Americans. Dr. Anderson.
Thank you so much, Danielle. I'm really looking forward to this conversation.
Oh, yes. Excellent. Excellent. As am I. I feel like we did a short video to do some advertising for this, and one of the things I mentioned was the line that stuck with me from White Rage, and we can get into that at some point. But it is something about your books. A line always sticks with me, and the one I am still stuck with is, if Americans wanted a United States, it was going to cost Black people dearly. I had an old political theory professor who said that all of liberalism is just about protecting property. And in that way, the Second Amendment really is about the right to protect property. So how deeply beholden to that do you think we still are, to that fear that our slaves, when armed, might become our masters?
Oh, I think it is deep. It is profound. It resonates. It is what we saw in the 17th century. We still see it today. You see it in the language. In the 17th century, it was about that these Black folks were inherently criminal, inherently violent, and that they weren't people, they were property. I mean, so that's part of what we also have to understand in this is that denial of African Americans' humanity, the denial of their right to be, and that the Second Amendment was about. There were all these other little elements, but core was this militia, and the way that the militia could protect the white community from the inherent violence of these Black folk who had been enslaved, and who were also, there were also free Blacks, and the fear of free Blacks When you think about the way that we hear the rhetoric about crime, crime, crime today, and the way that it is consistently centered in Blackness, and that becomes the rationale for militarizing the police. It becomes the rationale for not having gun safety legislation. It becomes the rationale for allowing AR-15s in the hands of civilians. It is, and it reminds me of Jonathan Metzl's Dying of Whiteness, where he did a
Mhm.
study in Missouri, and he was in rural Missouri, and he was in a support group with white families who had had gun violence happen in their families. When he brought up the possibility of gun safety legislation, it was, oh no, absolutely not, because all of those people from St. Louis will come down here and try to take everything that we have. All we have are our guns to protect us. I mean,
Mm.
so this is so foundational. And so this is also what happens when we don't do real history, when we don't get into the documents, when we don't read the best works that are out there to figure out how we got here. And so this battle that we're wrestling with now, where you see all of these states saying we don't want this divisive concepts being taught, what they're talking about is we don't want real American history to be taught. We want the sanitized version. Well, when you get the sanitized version, then this stuff doesn't make any sense.
Mm.
And that's what we have to get to.
Yeah, that's that as it happens. The line from White Rage I have is that everybody sees the flames, but they don't see the logs and the kindling, and that's we don't seeing is important.
Right. You know,
Hmm.
I love how you're pulling out the lines that also resonated with me. Um,
Oh, well,
yes,
that's
yes.
very flattering of you to say. Oh, that's wonderful. You mentioned two things in your answer there that make me want to ask some other stuff. And I think I'll start with this question about documents because I love this idea of trying to do history well, right?
Mhm.
And, for me, I was a political scientist for years, and a lot of what I lived with and felt like I was animating me was this idea that origins really matter for institutions, for organizations, for larger scale projects like the United States
Mhm.
of America. And so, it matters, where it matters where the police came from. It matters that it's still in the Constitution that being of African descent means you are only a 60% a person. That we could rewrite constitutions, by the way, y'all. You're allowed to do that. But something I noticed about the second, and it was very striking, is just how many primary sources you are citing, and you are telling the story of the way that this law evolved with the words of the folks who made it so. And I'm curious how important that was to you, and sort of laying down the claim that this was really only ever supposed to be a tool for racial exclusion.
It was absolutely essential. I mean, but if you look at my body of work, I go deep into the footnotes because it's so important to me, particularly in this nation where there is the continuous push that talking about blackness, talking about white supremacy, is that it's polemical. It's not based on fact. And as a historian, my work is based on fact. And so, for instance, having the words from Thomas Jefferson and James Madison and George Washington, the fear of the Haitian Revolution, and what that revolution meant for for black folks here, seeing that black folks could get free, and that scared, I'm going to use the scholarly term, bejeebers out of and it wasn't enough for me to say the bejeebers, they were scared out of their bejeebers. It was having them say it. You know, it was
Mhm.
having them say, oh, this fire is coming. If we don't snuff out this flame, we will be consumed. I mean, it is that fear of black people recognizing their freedom, their humanity, their right to rights
Mm,
that become so powerful. And so again, it is being able to get in there and do that heavy lifting. And I know that the archives can't tell us everything, but that is where having um, really good secondary literature, being able to get into the newspapers and knowing that newspapers also have their slants. So it's being aware of the biases and the slants and the slights and the silences, but also
mm,
listening to the people who were affected by this mess and what they're saying. That becomes so powerful in being able to weave together the story,
mm,
being able to see the implications of where folks go silent. So it
mm,
is like the Whiskey Rebellion and Shays Rebellion, where you have white folks taking on the government and trying to kill government folk because they don't want to pay the taxes, and then watching that government respond by saying, "Oh, we know you were mad. So no, you don't have to do time. Or if you had to do time, you only had to do a little bit of time because we understand." Right? And so it's understanding that, and you juxtapose that which at the same time with the way that the folks from the Stono Rebellion were treated, or the way that the
mm,
folks from Gabriel's uprising were treated, mass public hangings, or the one from the 1811 uprising in Louisiana,
mm,
where being beheaded and having your head put on a spike. I mean, you juxtapose that where black folks are trying to get free to white folks who rise up against the government because they don't want to pay taxes. And so with
mm,
seeing that, being able to look at that in real time, in historical time, gives us a
mm.
sense of the value system of a society.
Man, yeah. And see, there's something to this. This is a thing I could not help but note. I mentioned before we got on here that I reread White Rage a few
Mhm.
weeks ago, and a thing that's very striking in that book is just how important education is to as a kind of receptacle for white rage, and has as a receptacle for being a barrier to Black advancement. It's always really remarkable to me. But you talked about the Haitian Revolution, which is, first of all, I'm from Miami. I feel that in a lot of different ways. I was living there through, I believe, the demise of wet foot, dry foot policy and its aggressively unequal application across racial lines. Anyway, um, but I do think a lot about the fear of what the Haitian Revolution could teach this otherwise unteachable Black slave in the eyes of these folks, and in
Mhm.
their own words, right? What's the line? It's freedom and independence had now become what the founding fathers feared, a lethal virus that could not be quarantined in a whites only world. And then you even think about this whole idea, earlier, and then that we're talking about this idea that part of the demonization of Black folks is the belief that only white folks were actually responsible for fighting for American freedom and American liberty. And it's so striking how ideological all of this is. I'm also, again, I was a political scientist, or a political theorist masquerading as a political scientist for a really long time. So,
Mhm.
but I can't help but also, think about education as this huge linchpin in the battle over Black American civil rights. And so,
Yes.
to people who are a little bit skeptical about some of this, let's
Mhm.
give them the full case. How is this? Maybe this is just a war of ideas.
The war of ideas is the war about African Americans' civil rights, African Americans' humanity, African Americans' right to be, right to live. And so we see this. And so what I did, so let me kind of walk you through how I got to this book. It
Please.
was the killing of excuse me, the killing of Philando Castile. And so you have a black man in Minnesota who gets pulled over by the cops. The cop asks to see his ID. Philando Castile, following NRA guidelines, alerts the officer that he has a license to carry weapon with him, but he is reaching for his ID the way that the officer asked. The officer put 5 bullets into Philando Castile. He wasn't brandishing the weapon. He wasn't threatening the police officer. He was following NRA guidelines to let the officer know that he had a weapon. The NRA went virtually silent in the killing of a Black man who was killed simply for having a legal gun with him. Virtually silent. And this isn't the NRA, because this is the NRA when you had the uprising at Ruby Ridge and when you had Waco, they were hollering jackbooted government thugs. But they go silent when a Black man is killed simply for having a gun. And so folks started asking, well, do Black people have Second Amendment rights? And I thought, ooh, that's a good question. Because in my work, I have, from Eyes Off the Prize, where I'm following African Americans' human rights, all the way through to One Person, No Vote, I've been focused in on the rights of Black folk. So it was then in hunting down the Second Amendment that I had to go back into the era of slavery. So I'm back in the 1600s and I'm looking at the laws, and the laws are so clear. The way that they systematically deny access to guns and weaponry and bullets, they didn't have bullets back then, but ammunition, guns and ammunition. To not only to the enslaved, but to free Blacks as well. And each time Black folks are trying to get free, you see the laws doubling down, becoming more clear until we get to 1740, where you get the Negro Act in South Carolina that basically says Black folks are absolute slaves, and that they are inherently criminal, inherently violent, and they must be contained and controlled by white folk. That is foundational. So as I keep walking us through this, I get to the war for independence. And here you have we get this notion of the militia as taking on the British and kicking some British butt. That's not quite accurate, right? Sometimes they show up, sometimes they wouldn't. Sometimes they fight, sometimes they're like, peace out, I'm out of here. They're taking off running, right? George Washington is beside himself. And they thought all of these white men would come and join the Continental Army. They couldn't get white men to sign up for the Continental Army while they're taking on the most powerful military in the world. And so initially they had banned Black folk from joining the Continental Army. Well, after they were getting their butts kicked, I call it a USDA grade A prime beef butt whooping. After that was happening, then necessity required them to say, okay, you know what? We got a slew of Black folk up here. If we guarantee them that they will be free, then if they fight for us, then we've got to bring them in. And so the Continental Army was in fact a racially integrated army. You would never know that when you're hearing the kind of elegies about the American origin story. The other component of that was that when they merged, when they had that integrated Continental Army up north, then the British were like, oh, Shaggy, and said, we need to go hit the South because that's the soft underbelly, right? And so they head south and they take Savannah like that. And so now they're headed for Charleston. And so George Washington sends his emissary down to Charleston to say, look, you only got 750 white men who are available to take on this 8,000 man army that's coming your way. Because you got all your white men in the militia controlling your large slave population. Arm the enslaved. Let them know. South Carolina said, excuse me. And John Lawrence said again, arm the enslaved. And they said, you know what? We would rather take our chances with the king. So imagine the power of anti-Blackness, that you are ready to you're a traitor. but you're ready to ask for forgiveness from the king. And you know that the British will hang you for treason, for being a traitor. You're willing to risk that rather than arm the enslaved. I mean, that's the deal that South Carolina was cutting. Yeah.
God.
So
Yeah.
when we get to the Articles of Confederation weren't working. So the U.S. wins
Mhm.
the war, but the Articles of Confederation aren't working. So then it's time to draft a constitution. James Madison looks up and he's like, you know, that militia thing, that was messed up. You couldn't rely on them. Sometimes they so we need to like standardize their training. And so he put control of the militia under the federal government. When the ratification conventions were happening, when that thing hit Virginia with Patrick Henry, Mr.
Mhm.
Give me liberty or give me death, he was like, oh no. I mean, he went full Amy Winehouse. No, no, no. We are not doing this. George Mason said, we will be left defenseless if we don't control our militia, because if it's under federal control, that means those folks from Massachusetts and Pennsylvania will be able to decide when our slaves rise up. They will decide whether we will have the support we need to protect us. So no. And they said we would be willing to scuttle this constitution. Now, all James Madison hears is they're willing to destroy the United States of America. How do I get them on board? So they do ratify the convention with all kinds of constitution with all kinds of if then but clauses, but hanging over Madison is the threat that if they don't get the protection that they need, they're going to hold another constitutional convention. And so all Madison can think of is this is going to hurl us back to the unworkable Articles of Confederation. How do I save everything that we have worked so hard for? And so when you think about the Bill of Rights, because that was in the first Congress where he's drafting this Bill of Rights. When you think about it, freedom of the press, the freedom not to have a state sponsored religion, freedom of association, the right to not be illegally searched and seized, the right to have a speedy and fair trial, the right not to have cruel and unusual punishment, the right to a well-regulated militia. That's
Does feel a bit out of place.
Yeah, that thing is out of place. That's the bribe to the South. You can control the militia that will allow you to control Black people. So, sitting in the Bill of Rights is this right to contain and control the rights of Black folk. Yeah.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
Mhm.
Mm-hmm.
And we see this then as we follow through to the 1790 Naturalization Act that says who can be an American citizen. And what they really come down to, they were like, nobody Black can be an American citizen. But if you're white, you can be an American citizen. That was how they were determining which immigrant could be an American citizen. And then the 1792 Uniform Militia Act that says that every able bodied white male from 18 to 45 must join the militia and must own a gun. So you see this issue of citizenship and protection of the nation being embodied in law in whiteness. And that gun ownership is a white thing. That's where the protection comes from. And it tells you who gets protected and who does not. Yeah.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. Yeah.
Origin story.
Yeah, yeah. Origins matter, man. Oh, that tying citizenship to gun ownership piece, when you think about how long those are connected, it's like, yeah, of course we're here. Of course
Yes,
we're here.
yes, yes. And so this is why Philando Castile can get gunned down, but Dylan Roof can get arrested.
Yeah, it's a profound it's wild too, because we even now tell ourselves that everyone is protected by the Constitution. But this whole book is such a great articulation of how, first of all, no. And second of all, in this very particular thing, you cannot be protected by the thing you are the price of, right? Um, and it's wild. It's funny too because legally it's this choice that there are all these federal and state statutes making it illegal for Black folks to sort of even own guns, and very early awareness of this fear, right? And thinking about a little bit of this around white rage, I'm interested because it makes me think Second Amendment is about protecting property in much the way that a lot of the things that came out as a result of the election of a Black president, and I'm talking the political and legal ramifications. So I'm talking about the attacks on voting rights and the Republican immobilization politics that they're currently practicing. And I'm wondering, how do you see these things kind of tying together? Just the way that this fallout is so vast and codified.
Yes, it is. I guess one of the best ways for me to describe this is the January 6th insurrection.
Mm.
So when you think about it, during Barack Obama's second term, the U.S. Supreme Court passed or passed the Shelby County v. Holder decision that basically gutted the pre-clearance provision of the Voting Rights Act. Just 2 hours after they did that, Texas went full bore with a racially discriminatory voter ID law. Other states were right behind them, because they were like, yeah, we got to shut this thing down. Because Obama brought what I call the Obama coalition, because he had that ground game. He brought millions of new voters to the polls. And they were overwhelmingly African American, Asian American, Latinos, young folk, and poor folk. And so when you look at our voter suppression laws, these are the groups that are targeted in these voter suppression laws.
Mm-hmm.
And so 2016 happened, Lord, because folks were what I call were on the drug of American exceptionalism. That we can survive whatever happens here. Well, what happened was Trump, and because of voter suppression, Black voter turnout went down by 7% in that election. And you can just kind of track it. So, what the pundits were talking about, well, Black folks just couldn't stand Hillary, so they just didn't show up. So they missed things like voter ID laws or poll closures, moving polls, moving places where people can get the IDs that they need to vote. All of those, shutting down early voting hours, all of those sorts of things. They missed all of that. Well, then grassroots organizations were like, whoo, and they went in hard, hot, and heavy in getting folks over and through and around and over all of these voter suppression laws. So you started seeing mass registrations and mass voter turnout to try to save this democracy. And so we wouldn't have a hair invoked democracy, which is one where you have a vast rightless labor pool and you have a small strata of whites who are able to just absorb all of the resources generated by this vast rightless labor pool. That turnout. So in 2020, you had massive voter turnout in the midst of a pandemic, and it threw a white supremacist out of the White House. When you hear the language, it's like they stole the election in Atlanta. They stole the election in Philadelphia. They stole it in Milwaukee. They stole it in Detroit. You see that these are cities that have large, sizable Black populations. And remember the language of inherent criminality that links Black folks with crime. So here you have Black folks stealing something from good, honest, hard-working white Americans. They stole this election, and that drumbeat was on over and over and over, even to the point where Rudy Giuliani was talking about the Black women here in Atlanta in Fulton County who are passing out ballots and USB ports like they were dope dealers, like it was cocaine and heroin. I mean,
Mhm.
this is the language of Black criminality that then sends these folks storming the Capitol because their election was stolen by these unworthy criminal Black people.
Mhm.
And when you're seeing the language as well, you're seeing them talk about using their Second Amendment rights
Yeah.
in order to regain control of this nation, to basically intimidate election workers and to rise up to reclaim what has been stolen. And I mean the language of Second Amendment, Second Amendment, Second Amendment. And I detail some of it in the book in the afterword in for the paperback. So that thing about using guns and citizenship and protecting the white community from Black folk, January 6th. January
Mhm.
6th. We saw it on full display. Yeah.
Mhm. Mhm.
Yeah. And understand that language after January 6th, it didn't chasten these the right wing. Instead, they doubled down with more voter suppression laws because they're like the laws that we had up there didn't stop them, didn't stop Black folks from voting like we thought that it would. Instead,
Mhm.
they turned out anyway, and so how do we so you get when I talk about with white rage is that for every movement of significant Black advancement, there is a
Mhm.
massive policy backlash. And so we're
Mhm.
living in the midst of that policy backlash. This is the fury about the
Mhm.
2020 election that we are living
Yeah.
with. And and I have to say, we're also dealing with the fury of 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 the of the anger that coursed through 50 states with the killing of George Floyd. When you had this
Mhm.
mass protest movement happening, demanding accountability, demanding that police stop killing Black folk, and you had white folks participating in this. And so I remember it was in DC during a Black Lives Matter protest where the cops were coming at a young Black man and a young white woman jumps in front of him because she understands her privilege. She understands that the cops will hesitate before they shoot her. And so you can imagine the right wing thinking, how did she learn that? How does she know that? Well,
Who told her?
for that, right? And in that summer, the New York Times bestsellers were all books dealing with racism, white supremacy,
Mhm.
and African American history. Right? Books are
We saw
powerful.
some of those.
Yes, yes, you did. Books are powerful. Knowledge is powerful. And so it is in that knowledge. So you're seeing that backlash to that. How do we shut down access to those types of books? How do we make them verboten? How do we make them that thing that becomes toxic that you don't want to touch? How do we do that? And that's what we're seeing as they're taking over colleges, as they're
Mhm.
banning certain types of majors, as they are trying to contain and constrain what we know, as they're trying to rewrite history, as they're trying to come up with a new origin story that is the old origin story that only whites fought for this nation, that only whites built this nation. I call it the Rick Santorum School of History, uh, where he said Europeans came to this empty land and we built this.
Empty? Okay.
Right?
Okay.
And it's just like there is so much wrong in that. But when that becomes the origin story, it then allows policies to emanate that said, who is deserving, who is undeserving, who built this, who did not, who are the makers, who are the takers. Yeah,
Mm,
yeah.
yeah. Oh man. Uh, yeah. Oh, the Rick Santorum School of History is going to sit for a bit. That's very good. I will steal that. I will credit you.
Okay.
It looks like I've got some time. So I want to touch on something because I like the idea that each of these big books about this big particular problem, right? White Rage, and then this book, the second, are kind of inspired by uh, death. And like is an interesting choice of words there, but really it's just interesting that Michael Brown is a bit of the stated inspiration for getting started on White Rage, and Philandro is for this book as well. So kind of an off the beaten-ish path. So you obviously did a ton of primary source research. Is there some particular thing that like really, like you clearly started with the idea that there's something funky about this particular one. The Second Amendment's a little bit of a weird one. Is there something in particular you came across in your research that like really changed how you think about it entirely?
Well, I walked into the research on the Second Amendment really thinking through the ways that we debate it now. Is this about a militia or is this about the individual right to bear arms? And it was seeing the depth of the anti-blackness in the codes, in the laws, in the ways that those laws were deployed, that really helped me shatter that. Is this about the militia or is this about the individual right to bear arms? Because it became clear that regardless of the legal status of Black folks, whether they were enslaved or free Blacks, or whether they were what they called denizens between that limbo land between enslaved and citizen, or whether they were emancipated after the Civil War and then became citizens, or whether they were in Jim Crow, or whether they were in the Civil Rights era, or whether they were in the we have overcome era. Regardless of the legal status of Black folks, the same stories kept happening about how Black folks did not have the right to self-defense, about how Black folks did not have the right to bear arms, about how Black folks did not have the right to carry. I mean, it was just, you just kept seeing it over and over and over. So it really, that was the piece for me, was that the legal status of Black folks did not change what we saw happening during the era of slavery, which was that intense anti-Blackness, and
Yeah.
defining Black folks as criminal, and defining the white community as needing protection from these Black folk.
Mm. Yeah. I am gonna do this is my last pull quote, I promise. I really also like that line from The Hate You Give. It's impossible to be unarmed when your blackness is the weapon that they fear. And violence and being perceived of as a threat and knowing what a threat that is to your personal harm is such a huge part of having any historical awareness as a Black person. Everybody knows, and I think much more commonly now also know that a lot of the rage is directed at Black aspiration on any level, including basic humanity. And there's this whole notion when we get to, as we're getting to the chapter that talks a lot about the Black Panther Party,
Mhm.
there's this line: Blacks were ushered into the killing fields, African Americans' military uniforms angered, their self-defense enraged, their right to bear arms triggered, their claims to citizenship lynched. And that is a strong visual metaphor, as I think what they call that officially, right? And it's interesting because then we get into this chapter on the Black Panthers and the way they basically become the visual avatar for this kind of threat. And their goal, though, at the core of it was a defense of and a bolstering up of Black communities. And, but this is at the same time a people with their claims to citizenship lynched, right? And so, I mean, on some level, like, how do we explain, this is a trite notion, but persevering in the face of terrible adversity? And are there any ways to sort of see where we're at now, even as recent with the January 6th stuff, like seeing a way through the way that Black bodies are perceived as such a threat.
And that has been the strength of Black folks, has been their vision of what could be,
Mm,
and pulling upon the community, not believing in this kind of rugged individualism stuff, because that's going to get you out there all by yourself. Um,
mm,
but it is really pulling on the strengths of the community, and on the strengths of something greater than yourself, that there can be a better way. And so when I talk about the Rick Santorum School of History, part of that is um, is basically saying, we built this, whites built this nation all by themselves. And it's saying that we have reached, when it says we hold these truths to be self-evident, the Rick Santorum School of History treats that aspiration as an achievement that has already happened. Black
mm,
folks know that hadn't happened. And so you
mm,
see this continuous striving to make that aspiration real.
mm,
And that's where the work is. That's where we see the rallies. That's where we see the massive voter turnouts. That's where we see educating our kids. That's where you see demanding environmental justice. That's where you see,
mm,
because we know if we give up, it doesn't get better if we give up. It
mhm,
only gets better when we continue to engage to fight for that better world.
mhm,
That's where the hope is. That's where I've consistently seen the hope. And it's
mhm,
powerful. It is
mm,
powerful.
mhm. What is it? Activism is a never-ending job, right?
Oh yeah. Oh yeah.
Oh
Well,
yeah.
you know what, what's the thing? The price of liberty is eternal vigilance.
Yeah,
Yeah.
yes. Yep, just gotta write that down real quick.
It's
Yes.
not original. I quoted it from
No.
the okay.
That's okay. I heard it from you though, so that's where the association will always be. It's true though. It's the what is it? When people speak and try to wax poetic about the American project, and again, former political scientist, I've heard it all. But the thing they always talk about is it's a thing in progress, right? It's a project that's never complete. And there is something sort of hopeful about being like, oh, we can actually take lessons from these communities that just as a society we've aggressively oppressed, and it turns out we can learn from just resilience. You keep going is the answer on some level.
Yeah, you keep
Um,
going and you keep having a vision. It is that
mhm,
vision. I call it the imagining part. You know, the
mm,
enslaved had to imagine what freedom was, even when everything around them told them that that wasn't a possibility. Folks
mm,
in Jim Crow had to imagine what citizenship was, even when there was nothing around them that said that that was a possibility. And
mm,
now we have to imagine what humanity, our humanity is, even
mm.
when there's so much around us that tells us that that's not a possibility.
Yeah, yeah.
Yeah.
This is why I read a lot of speculative fiction. I have a friend who's always talking about building models of possibilities for ourselves, and I'm like,
Mm.
yes, give me another world. How can we do this better?
You know, and two of my degrees are in political science, and
Oh,
so yeah, right.
you
And
understand.
yes, I do. And so for me, it's also understanding how we get from that imagining
Mhm,
to the reality. What are the nuts and bolts of it? How do we operationalize it?
mhm,
That's what's also so important. So for this book, the second part of it is to understand what its roots are, what its core is, so that when folks are talking about, you know, after Sandy Hook, right, or
mhm,
after Las Vegas, and you don't see real movement on these laws after Uvalde, where
mhm,
babies are in elementary school, um, and you don't see movement on the laws. And it's like, well, how can this be? We love our children. We are more afraid of Black folk than we are in protecting our children. When we understand that, then we're having a very different kind of conversation. We have to dismantle anti-Blackness in order to really begin to move forward in terms of full humanity in this nation.
Fantastic. Fantastic. Well, I appreciate this personal sermon from me. I hope everybody else has also been enjoying it. As it happens, they have. We have a couple of questions from our audience, and we are at about that time. So I thank you all
Right.
for participating. We have probably fit maybe one more in. So Evan asks, how much can the US learn from other countries' stricter gun laws, Australia or the UK, for example? Or has the extent of our gun ownership created just a more unique situation?
I think the depth of slavery and that history has created a different situation where guns have been aligned and defined as white citizenship, as the need for white protection against Black folk. And also, I have to add, Roxanne Dunbar Ortiz's book, Loaded, also looks at Indigenous people and the Second Amendment. And so you begin to see how racialized the Second Amendment is, and how it is so based on fear and so based on protecting the white community from the other. And I think that that's one of the things that, because the US knows when it's looking at homicides, and so we've got 400 million guns in the US. So we got more guns than we got people, and we are not safe. But so when you the US knows the data. We've seen the data that in terms of homicides, in terms of the violence and the hell that guns wreak, in terms of the mass shootings, you don't see that in Australia. You don't see that in the UK. You don't see that in Germany. You see it here. We know this. And so the question is, then why aren't we doing something about it? And then that's when you go through this history and you see and you go, oh. And that's why I say knowing this history helps us understand what we're wrestling with.
Yeah, such a vital context for our politics. You always hear people say, "Oh, why can't we pass universal health care? Like, pick a Scandinavian country," and you're like, well, "Yeah, we got some
Mhm.
deep-seated stuff in here."
So, and again, I
Yes.
go back to Jonathan Metzels, where he also did a thing in Missouri asking older Black men who benefits from having access to health care, health insurance. And they're like, everybody. Then Metzel asked older white men who benefits, and they went, oh, those illegals and those welfare queens. And so it was the unwillingness to have universal health care, because the people that you despise, even though you need it desperately, the people you despise might also get access to it. That's part of what we have to understand about our politics and our policies. And that's why you also see this massive backlash against the kinds of work that is coming out about the role of structural racism, about the role of intersectionality, about the role of critical race theory. You see this kind of backlash against that deep, heavy lifting, that deep analytical work to dissect how we got here. Yeah.
It's a lot of work too. Like, ugh, man. We have another audience question.
Mhm.
Chris asks, do you think we can use the Constitution and Bill of Rights against white supremacy? If not, then what do you see as the path to democracy in the best sense?
And actually, we can. And this is why elections matter so much. You get this kind of poo-pooing of voting, like, it's going to stay the same. But I look at it like football. If all you do is run the ball, they know then that the defense doesn't get stretched and your running back can't get through. If all you do is throw the ball, your quarterback is going to get sacked. It is a multi-pronged strategy that it takes. And elections are a key strategy. So let me tell a story. It was
Mhm.
October 2016, and I was at the Schomburg in New York giving a talk on voting rights and voter suppression.
Mm.
At the end of the talk, young brother stands up. He's like, yo, yo, I hear you, sister. But you know what? Trump and Hillary are just the same. And I was like, no, no, no. It's like Hillary is a politician. You can get to her. Trump is a
Mhm.
demagogue. And I said, more than that, there are like 5 or 6 Supreme Court justices who are knock knocking or have already passed 70's door. If he gets in, he will have the opportunity to appoint up to 6 justices of the US Supreme Court. What that means then is that our laws are going to be eroded, eviscerated. The ways that after Reconstruction, where the radical
Mhm.
Republicans in Congress, the 13th Amendment, 14th Amendment, 15th Amendment, the Force Acts, the Enforcement Acts, all of those got eviscerated by the US Supreme Court, set us back 100 years. That's why elections matter. It's the judges in the state courts who are deciding cases that deal with our rights. So knowing who those judges are, doing that work makes that's how the Constitution can be really effective in really moving forward in this human rights, humanity force. But it
Mm.
requires us voting knowledgeably.
Mm.
and
Yeah.
and and if, like I said before, if we sit out, there's no hope.
Mm.
There's no
Mhm.
hope.
Mhm. Yeah. 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 No, it turns out participation is what we're doing. Democracy is a participant sport.
It
Um,
really is. It really is.
yeah.
Um, and we
Yeah.
know that there will be backlashes to that participation. There always has been. We
Mm-hmm.
continue to move forward.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. Yeah. Well, I think we have time for one more, and I have one more, so I want to do it. Um, so we're talking about dismantling mythologies and basically how to kick our habit of the drug of exceptionalism. And something that I think is really interesting in that is like I said, like you said, frankly, first of all, doing history well and engaging with it and recognizing what questions we really have to ask, but it also kind of means having to interact with these like failed deterrents, right? Like you've got a lot of stuff that you see as a reaction to the George Floyd protests, but even going far back as like the Trayvon Martin protests and stuff, you see all of these like Blue Lives Matter laws and stuff like that. And you see all of these legal, like sort of kitchen sinky kind of stuff that they throw at the wall to kind of mitigate progress. And I'm wondering if there is a different way to see that at all, right? Like, I'm asking you for more hope. I'm sorry, but I'm wondering if we can sort of see like the increased desperation. Like, do you see a possibility in there for like, oh, this is how you know this is. Okay, is it too much to hope? Are these the death knells?
Yeah, these are the yes, these are the really desperate measures to try to hold back the wall of humanity. To try, this is why you see what they call anti-woke legislation. But when DeSantis's attorney had to go before a court and define woke, he said it is the belief that there is systemic inequality and that you have a responsibility to dismantle that inequality. Wow. Wow. Right? And
Talk
so,
about
and
saying the
so,
quiet part loud.
right? But see, this is what happens when you're under oath. You got to tell the truth. And so it isn't. So what we're seeing is trying desperately to craft these ways to keep back that push of humanity, that knowledge base that systemic inequality is real, and we don't have to live like this. Because that becomes the second piece of that. Not only does this thing exist, but it doesn't have to exist. And so we can work to dismantle that thing. And it is that combination that has basically created this hysteria. I mean, let's face it, under what other circumstances? Let me back up. When Trump ran for president, there were 15, 16 other Republicans running for that nomination, many of whom had policy experience. They had, worked in government. They had legislative experience. They had done that kind of work. He didn't have that. He wasn't a good businessman. He didn't have any policy experience. What he had was a kilo of pure uncut white supremacy that he threw on the table and said snort. It started with birtherism, take a hit. And then it was coming down the escalator. Mexicans are rapists and criminals. And so you ask yourself, how is it that somebody who has no experience but has a kilo becomes president of the United States? It is the hysteria of massive voter suppression and the hysteria that our world is changing. It is changing in a way that our old way. So make America great again. If you would ask them, okay, when was it great? You would get these dates. Before 1950, before 1920. Okay. And you start thinking about what that means. And you're like, okay, got it. Got it. That's the threat. That's the fear. That's the hysteria. That is why we keep pushing. So, yes, they're desperate. We deserve to live into our fullness. We deserve to experience the pursuit of life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness. We deserve that. And these measures that you see, I mean, they really speak to a willingness to basically burn the United States down in order to maintain that Herrenvolk kind of vision that they have. And we're saying no, no, not today.
Yes. Yes.
Yes.
Not today, Satan. Not today.
Not today.
Dr. Anderson, you are a delight and a treasure. Thank you so much for being here with us today. Thanks to all of our friends in the audience for being with us and for submitting such great questions. We appreciate y'all so much. You may buy additional signed copies of The Second at Left Bank Books. Come on down. We'd love to have you. And truly, again, I thank you for your time tonight. It's been wonderful.
Thank you. This has been great. Thank you so much.
Excellent. All right, y'all. Have a wonderful night.
Okay, bye.